self-introduction part.
There's more to you than just a senior software engineer.
No, that's basically it. So welcome to Accessibility and UX. The subtitle there is actually a really funny joke, and I'd like to tell you that at the end of this presentation you'll get that joke, but you won't, because this is not a technical talk. If you want to know that joke, you should come to the workshop next week. I might explain it then. Like I said, this is not a technical talk, so what are we going to talk about? With the month of things, like Mike said, it's a brown bag and a workshop and other stuff. But we like to focus on the workshop, and everything sort of flows out of the workshop. And the workshop this month is sort of about improving developer accessibility. So this is going to sort of tangentially and at a higher level discuss how to be better at software development when it comes to accessibility. And UX. This is also not going to cover the same information that is available, that is being covered by the accessibility and user experience training that's being offered currently every Wednesday at 11:30. If you'd like to know more about that, I'll talk about it after. You might have seen notices go out through ABCD about that. So I'll start off talking about legality. Legality is something that seems to interest a lot of people when it comes to accessibility, because accessibility is the only best practice that actually has laws associated with it. I don't really like talking about legality just because I feel it's a backwards way to be thinking about accessibility. You shouldn't be building accessibility because of the laws, you should be building accessibility because of the people. But because it's of interest to people, I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about it. In academia, we're subject to a few different laws, but the one that really matters is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Because in the ADA, educational institutions are called out specifically. What does the ADA say, though? Basically, it is ensure equal access to everyone. The ADA was written in the 90s, and that was before we really knew what the interwebs were doing. We knew anything. But the way it was written is fantastic because it's kind of timeless. It allows us to cover people regardless of how technology changes in the future. At the same time, though, it's very frustrating to development professionals because we're kind of looking for a checklist on how to be accessible. Thankfully, there exists a checklist. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The WCAG, as I say it, I think other people say it differently. I don't know why I just went with WCAG because when I started reading it, that's how I read it. I think other people say WCAG, and I'm a supporter of WCAG because I kind of like that shortening. But I say WCAG. It's an open standard, and it's what most of the world looks to for accessibility. So let's talk about the standard for a second. The standard is a slog. It's not something you try to read through. It's something that I, for the last few months, have been using to put my son to sleep at night. I start reading it to him, and he's out. But I mean, honestly, I could talk about anything work-related, and it would put him to sleep. And if I'm going to be really honest, it doesn't matter who I'm talking to.
I'm not sure what you said.
Facing point. Good timing, Siri.
Great. Anyway, the target for all web developers is to meet WCAG in some way. I'm not even talking about the HUIT target. I'm talking about all web development. the target should be to meet this. But we can't get that overnight. We have to take small steps in that direction. Luckily, here at HUIT, we have a nice resource in the Software Standardization Handbook, where someone has gone through the effort of creating a simplified list as well as a getting started guide. And that person is not above self-promoting in the third person, which is really nice. So WCAG, I've said, is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. 2.0, it's the second version. 1.0 was in 2003, I think, and then 2.0 was in 2008, and since then it goes through a revision process every year, and it improves itself. But the AA is sort of the level that it's at. And that's where a lot of people have some confusion. The knowledge required between A and AA and AAA is not very much, but to actually implement them becomes significantly harder. So an example is captioning. For A, you just need to have captions available when you post the video. For AA, you need to have captions available as it's streaming live. For AAA, you need to have sign language and extended audio descriptions. So it becomes harder as you go up through the scales. For color, in A, you can't express you can't express meaning through color alone. For AA, you can't have the color contrast ratio exceed 4.5 to 1. What that means is if you have a blue next to a blue, they can't be too similar. One's got to be really dark and one's got to be really light. For AAA, the color contrast bumps up to 7 to 1. And what that means is you basically have to have black and white. It has to be, you have to be able to check it with something that'll give you the grayscale of the page. And that really limits design options in a lot of ways. So these are all really the same concepts, they're just different levels. I had a really good example that used drunk driving and like the legal limit, but I was told not to use that one because because it uses, yeah, anyway. In terms of learning the WCAG, the levels are insignificant. But in terms of applying the WCAG, the levels become very important. So why does accessibility seem so difficult? Whenever I talk to someone about it, their eyes kind of glaze over and they're like, oh my God, this is just more work. We have good reasons. Accessibility takes time. It requires QA, it requires an understanding of the syntaxes, a closer look at how our users function. This is overhead that we don't feel we can afford sometimes, and it's very understandable. It's extra work. It is extra work. But what probably really gets us is the fact that it's unknown work. It's a bunch of work, and we don't really know how much, so it's this big looming thing in the distance. And we're kind of scared to find out what it's going to require. But I've got good news. Accessibility is very easy. Technically, it's less than 1% of the typical UI knowledge that a web developer needs to have. It's some additional HTML attributes, a little bit of JavaScript, and I'm going to run through 7 things right now that'll get you over 90, 95% of the way there. Captions. This one first is really funny because, you know, I just said accessibility is easy. Captioning is actually very difficult, but it's difficult in the content creation aspect of it. It's difficult to actually get those captions. From a software development standpoint, implementing captions, once you already have them, is very easy. Form labels. Every form element needs to have a label. You want to make sure that there's a label associated with what you're inputting. Focus for all interactive elements, making sure that all elements that can be interacted with have focus and that you manage that focus. If you click on something and it like opens a modal, you want to make sure that the focus travels with you into that modal. And then when you close that modal, you want the focus to go back. However, most of the time, people don't think about this, and the focus ends up somewhere else. Which, if you're relying on the focus to navigate around the page, you just got put somewhere randomly on the page and you don't know what's going on. Using standard elements. When a button is a button, use a button. When an anchor link is an anchor link, use an anchor link. This may seem easy, but sometimes developers like to sometimes developers feel it's easier to create a custom widget rather than use an existing one and then go through the process of restyling that existing one to look like what they want it to look like. But by creating this custom widget, they're really ruining all of the built-in accessibility that exists with these standard elements. Everything conveyed with an image or color needs to be described in some way using text. Everything needs to have a textual alternative. Skipping repetition. The obvious one with this is like one of those hidden links at the top that skips you past a huge amount of navigation. But this is also about making sure that your content is semantically labeled internally. Because a lot of people use special hotkeys to jump around in the text. So if you don't have, let's say, a main element, and somebody's trying to jump to the main content, they're not going to be able to get there. A uniform layout. This one's important to just not change up your layout from page to page. Have something stay the same. If you have a navigation, have it stay the same throughout your site. And keep with the theme. This will get you, I say 90%, but you know, that's kind of a made up percentage anyway. So who needs accessibility? People usually consider kind of the extreme when they think of accessibility. It's just the blind and the deaf, which is like 1% globally, and in the US it's actually less than 1%. And that becomes statistically close to 0, right? So it's easy to have like we don't need to worry about less than 1% of our users, right? But blind and deaf are just one end of the spectrum, and it's actually a very wide spectrum. There's low vision, color blindness, low hearing, tinnitus, people with decreased mobility, impaired cognitive function, just age-related stuff that happens to us. The most conservative estimate I've found in the spectrum is 20% of people. So 20% of people are going to benefit from making sure your stuff is accessible. Here at Harvard, we have students, faculty, and alumni. But that's actually not it. One of the challenges that we face is that everything that we put in the public is also needs to be accessible. And I mean, Harvard, we do a lot of stuff in the public. We throw a lot of stuff out there. And people come to Harvard because we're Harvard, right? This turns out to be a very large user base that we need to worry about. My user experience, I happen to fall in the spectrum. I'm colorblind. I'm often affected by sites that use color to convey meaning. You can hear it work with things like roadmaps. People love to use color to convey meaning in roadmaps. And it's like they'll have a red means one project, and then green means another project, and blue means another project, and they're not even that distinct. Sometimes they'll do like light purple and dark blue and teal, and those all basically look the same to me. It's very frustrating. Things like burn down charts, burn down and burn up charts. I sort of get the idea. I mean, you know, the burn ups go up and the burn downs go down. usually, right? But I mean, you've got scope changes, and sometimes it does a little bit of this, and then it gets, I don't know what's going on in the chart anymore. It's very annoying. I also have very poor hearing. Because of that, I'm always watching TV with captions on, and I'm a strong opponent to calling into meetings because I have trouble hearing people if I can't actually see them. I also avoid teaching online classes for the same reason. I can function, for the most part, without people developing their page to be color accessible, and I can turn up the volume most of the time. But it's a better experience when people actually think about these things. I'm also very lazy. When I can, I don't like to use a mouse when I'm on a web page. I like to be able to tab through and just get to the content that way. For a while in the like 2003 to 2010 range, when Flash became all the rage and people were making all their sites really, really awesome looking, that became impossible. I wasn't able to get anywhere using just tabbing around the page. And if I had to do that, that would have been a terrible experience. The web would have been inaccessible for me. Luckily, luckily technology has caught up with accessibility at this point, and it's very easy to create an accessible application that is also very pretty. UX is a fun buzzword these days, and it's really fun to draw the lines between, like, how something that's accessible can also be usable to the general population, like how those ramps on the buses are great for strollers, or how the little blue buttons out in front of, there's no one up there. How the little blue buttons in front of like almost every building, I thought there was for some reason. I was going to point to it, but there's nothing there.
But you gotta still look.
Like if you're carrying a bunch of groceries or something, or your hands are full, you can just, like, bump it with your butt and open the door. That's useful. But that's not really what I want to talk about. What I'm more interested in talking about is the simple ways we can think about UX. What's nice about mobility is it imposes simplicity and focus by limiting our real estate and forcing us into really big buttons. We have to really kind of focus on what the user needs to be doing on our site. Complexity is the enemy. Focus on what's important to your app. Stop trying to design the best thing ever, because the best applications are the ones that perform singular actions. While that isn't ideal to sort of limit your application down to one thing, I realize that's not possible in most scenarios. But you should identify what your base function is, what you're really trying to get people to do on your site, and build off of that. I made this too. Yeah, too many animations. Sorry. Flexibility. We already design flexibility in terms of we're flexible on the kind of device, or we should be flexible in the kind of device at this point with mobility. It's not much of a leap then to design for flexibility of how your app is used with tabs or with hotkeys or with gestures. With a solid and simple design, users are free to make use of your application however they want. Simplicity is my favorite Agile principle. It keeps stories small, goals achievable, and everything understandable. You want to keep things under control. You don't want half a dozen things updating on your page. You don't want distracting elements sort of coming in halfway through a presentation. Kind of,
Somebody had to stop it.
Think about the most successful applications like Twitter or Instagram, anything Google makes. Google itself is just a singular image with a text input, and I want to say one button, but I can't remember. Do they still have the I'm feeling lucky button? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so Google is an extremely complex application, but they've taken the complexity away from the user. So how do we get there? How do we get started? We don't need a massive process to get started. We can actually get started with very little accessibility knowledge. How do we do it? We start with a static audit. What's a static audit? It's a site where you give it a URL, or it's a browser plugin that will look at your page structure and give you a report back as to whether it's accessible or not. This is actually a very accessible, you can't see it. Darn it. Anyway,
There was something on the side.
yeah, I know. You can't see the actual URL. It's funny because the URL has a name. Explaining that makes it very funny, I know.
And the issues, I think I tried this with the pin-enabled app, and it just gets stuck telling you that pin is not.
Right, for a pin-enabled app, you really have to use a browser plugin, which will do basically the same thing, but you have to get through the pin and then do it. That's why you can't do it on like a public, on like the Wave, the public site.
Right. So this is, you can't use this for most of our.
For most of our stuff, yeah. For most of our administrative apps, you can't use this. But I mean, Wave has a toolbar which functions identically. It's just it's a button integrated with your browser. Then. Yeah. So what it'll do is it'll give you a readout. This site that that's not big enough at all. This site that I did is actually very accessible. It was made by someone who knows what they're doing. But you can see, but you can see, if you could see, there are 2 errors there and 3 alerts. Now, I usually say that audits, these static audits are terrible. I like to say they're terrible because they encourage people to use them as a one-stop accessibility checker. They miss a lot, and they catch a lot of false positives. But they're still useful. If you're new to accessibility, they're great because they can introduce you to concepts that you weren't aware of before. If you're a seasoned accessibility expert, you can run them and you know which ones to ignore, which ones are not real, which ones are the false positives. In this, I had the document language was missing, which is an actual error. I forgot to put HTML, was it lang equals n? I forgot to throw that in. But it was like a 2-second fix because I ran this. And then the other error is an empty link, and that one's not a real one because the site is responsive. And when I ran this, it was actually on the full size, not the minimized size. And it's complaining that there's an empty link where the hamburger is. The hamburger is like the 3 lines on a mobile device where you click it and the menu comes down. But if you're expanded to the full web version, you don't see the hamburger. So that's a false positive. The alerts are because of possible heading issues where I've got a mismatched header. But that's because I'm including a page into my page. And I know I'm doing that, and that's clear because I've put in the roles appropriately. But when it ran this, it saw that I had like an H1, an H2, an H3, and then an H1 again. So after a static audit, you should try going through your application without a mouse, without a screen, or without speakers, not all at the same time. If you can make use of all of the functionality of your site without having all of the resources you typically have available, you'll get a better understanding of how other people have to use your site. This is going to be time consuming, but the more you do it, the faster it becomes until you just do it out of habit. All of the tools you need to do this, like screen readers and color contrast tools and magnifiers, they're all free. They're all readily available. They take a little time to learn how to use, but that's part of next week's workshop. We're going to go through some of those tools and try them out. So who needs to be doing these things? Well, QA, right? Because they're the ones who have to be checking everything. They need to know. They need to know to check as an accessible user. But in order for a developer to develop these things, they're going to need to understand why they're doing it. Can you imagine if a developer were developing a site that they never once looked at? That's sort of the same thing as a developer developing a site and not thinking about accessibility. They're not using it. They're not using it the way it's used, so they're not going to catch anything. And of course, you need your product owners, your business analysts, your project managers, whatever you call them, the people who help you do the roadmaps, who put together the backlog. It's important that these people understand that accessibility is work and it takes time, and they need to be on board with how much time this is going to take. When you're sizing a story, they need to understand that it's going to take longer. All of these things require a change in process. Like any other best practice, you have to be okay with making time for it. When creating a story, add time to account for accessibility. When you first start doing this, it's going to possibly double the size of your story, maybe triple the size of your story, because you're learning. That's how processes are integrated. Over time, though, this overhead shrinks and shrinks until it just becomes another part of your development. And once you understand these concepts, once you can develop them in, they just happen. It's a very minimal overhead. A common anti-pattern when adding things to a process like accessibility, like any best practice, is to create a separate story just for that best practice, like a separate code review story or a separate unit test story or a separate documentation story. These are the stories that we all know get pushed because, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to finish creating this new feature for the client, or are you going to document or run unit tests? You already know it works, right? You don't need that unit test. That's already done. You need to avoid doing that. But sometimes you have to. You'll always run across times when you forgot to think about something, when you forgot to do maybe documentation on something, and you have to go back, and there has to be a spike for it, where you go back and you research and you learn and you remediate. These are unavoidable, but they shouldn't be the norm. You shouldn't plan for remediation. Yeah. It's important to stay agile, and I don't mean sticking to Scrum. I mean being flexible to change, allowing yourself to do progressive enhancement on your process. And that's basically the end of this, but I have a couple more slides. We have this accessibility committee. What have they been up to? In the last, this accessibility committee was formed last year. What have they been up to? They received funding for fiscal year 15, enough to hire the Paciella Group, which is a third-party accessibility group, expert group, yeah, to try to bring in the expertise that we were aware that we don't really have. We're putting a site together, and the mobility group is working toward two applications by the end of June that will be mobile. They're also working in conjunction with the accessibility committee to try to meld those initiatives to make sure that they're all on the same page with them. The workshop next week will be focusing on 3 basic concepts. First, we'll be going over screen readers. We'll be downloading a simple browser-based screen reader and going through the tutorial to get a feel for how others interact with the web. The majority of it is going to be making use of an open source project called AliGoat, named similarly to the more famous WebGoat, which is a purposely insecure application to teach web security. AliGoat shows purposely inaccessible, examples or exercises which allow you to inline change them and fix them. It also gives you, it points you at the resources that you need and explains how to accomplish each exercise.
Is that really L's or ones?
That is actually ones. That's a great
You're just
question.
calling it algorithm.
Yeah, that's a great question. A11Y is the accepted hashtag for accessibility, because I mean if you write out hashtag accessibility in Twitter, that's 10% of your tweet right there. So people
Sorry?
that's 10% of your tweet.
What is?
Hashtag the word hashtag accessibility.
Oh, got it.
It's a very long word.
I see.
With the hashtag, it's 14 characters, which is 10% of the tweet. And people came up with this to sort of get around that.
So this means the same thing as accessibility?
Yes, when you see A11Y, it means accessibility.
It's like
In the same way, internalization and localization are done. Yeah, except this is slightly more widely used than those. And the third thing the workshop is fun. It's meant to be a place where you can come and learn by doing in a safe environment where you can ask questions and hopefully get answers. Speaking of questions,
When is the workshop? Or that's the next phase?
next week.
Same time.
Next week, same time.